Midway along scenic Route 9 spanning the Green Mountains of southern Vermont, you come to the town of Wilmington on the Deerfield River. As New England towns go, the peaceful community of 2,400 people looks picture postcard typical with its wooden buildings and crooked old steeples. Wilmington, though, has a special attraction, the Harriman Reservoir, also called Lake Whitingham. Twisting more than 8 miles along the south-running course of the Deerfield, the lake is the largest body of water entirely within Vermont. Of course, that doesn't count giant Lake Champlain, shared with New York and Canada. Vacationers put Lake Whitingham to countless recreational uses, including all manners of boating, as well as fishing for lake trout, bass, and walleyed pike. Surrounding forests abound with wildlife. Yes, moose and bald eagles, black bears, white-tailed deer, beavers, red foxes, minks, bobcats. Most eastern lakes are wall-to-wall with summer cabins. Lake Whitingham has only one residence on its 28 miles of shoreline, the old rural schoolhouse that the late parents of my wife, Irma Hawkins, bought in 1956 as a summer getaway cottage. The few neighbors live higher in the woods, and often we have the lake and mountain view to ourselves. Location, location, location. Although it is on a country road, the rustic cottage at the foot of Castle Hill has most modern conveniences and other essentials of a comfortable home. Even so, the vaulted wooden ceiling and the iron stove remind us every day that once upon a time the house was the one-room castle school. Some folks said it dated from around the Civil War, but nobody was sure. And we had heard that under the lake were the haunting ruins of a factory town called Mountain Mills. Curious for years, we resolved to explore these mysteries. What was the Deerfield Valley like before it was dammed and flooded? And why was the old schoolhouse spared? We pierced the mists of the lake and found traces of tumultuous social changes, a vanished way of life, and the tracks of a little railroad called the Hoot, Toot, and Whistle. The first white settlers came to these parts in 1751. By the time Molly Stark inspired Vermonters in the Battle of Bennington during the Revolutionary War, the rugged Green Mountains had a small population of subsistence farmers hacking out hard lives in the rocky glacial valleys. They cut down the dense primeval forests, raising sheep for meat and wool. Overlogging and the sheep's nibbling eroded Vermont's marginal soil until by the 1840s many of these proud grandchildren of the Revolution had pulled up stakes for flatter and richer land in the Midwest. The United States was a smaller nation then, but was about to expand to the Pacific because it provoked and won the Mexican War. It was during that war and not the Civil War we established through town records that the Castle School began. The prosperous farm of Philo Castle Jr., 28-year-old clerk of Wilmington School District No. 18, was on land overlooking the Deerfield that had descended from his grandfather. Wilmington farmer Timothy Castle's name as a lieutenant at the Battle of Bennington is cast in bronze outside the town library. Philo Castle, staying behind after his family moved west, deeded a plot owned with partner Simeon Adams for the school, which already had been built a quarter-mile east of the river. In 1849, Castle's annual report said 36 children attended the District No. 18 school during the 18 weeks it operated that year. On an 1856 map, the schoolhouse is marked SH on the main road between Wilmington and North Adams, Massachusetts, 25 miles southwest. For teachers, lesson plans were detailed hour to hour, with no First Amendment bother about separating church and state. In the Puritan tradition, New England school children were led through daily prayer and hymns. In addition to the 3 R's, There was a C, corporal punishment, liberally applied. The Wilmington economy shifted from sheep to cows, producing high-quality cream and butter. In 1833, to profit from a new toll road from Brattleboro to Bennington, the town had moved down from its hilltop origin to a spot on the Deerfield called Mill Hollow. Many New England rivers used the power of falling water to run sawmills and flour mills, and the Deerfield's water wheels were no exception. Farmers also could make a little extra money collecting maple syrup in wooden buckets. After the Civil War, the schoolhouse was on another map, renumbered as District School 14. The average Wilmington rural school around that time had 20 students. Teachers boarded with the children's families. The more children you had, the more weeks you had to feed the teacher. Almost always a woman paid less than $5 a week. Alva Crocker, a papermaker in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, dreamed of shipping his goods west to the Erie Canal at Albany, but the Berkshire Ranges posed a formidable barrier. Crocker pestered the Fitchburg Railroad into building the Hoosic Tunnel. Blasting it through a mountain for 4 3/4 miles to North Adams cost an unexpected 25 years, $10 million, and as many as 196 lives. Opened in 1877, the tunnel was an engineering marvel of its day. Manufacturers now could move their merchandise to railroads on the Hudson and on to the west. And the new east-west tracks brought dreams of prosperity to the small, poor, and isolated towns of mountain New England. The Newton brothers, enterprising papermakers in Holyoke, Massachusetts, were poised to seize the opportunity. Their Connecticut River factory needed more wood pulp. In 1883, to tap vast tracts of virgin spruce in the forests of the upper Deerfield Valley, they built a dam and 2 mills on the Deerfield at Reedsboro, Vermont, 11 miles north of the Hoosic Tunnel. It was the dawn of industry in the Deerfield Valley. In deep woods, Newton crews felled trees in winter, piling logs on the frozen river until the heavy spring runoff floated them to Reedsboro. Log drives a month long on the wild torrents were life-threatening for the river pigs, as the workers were called. Then the Newtons found that getting their milled pulp from Reedsboro down to the railroad for shipment to Holyoke required 40 horse-drawn freight wagons a day. This was inefficient and costly. They decided to build their own narrow-gauge railroad from the Hoosic Tunnel to Reedsboro. By 1885, despite some hair-raising mountain terrain, the Deerfield Valley Railroad, as it was called, was built and in full operation. The next year, the brothers renamed it the Hoosic Tunnel and Wilmington Railroad. Reedsboro boomed with the jobs the HT&W brought. New factories making boxes, chairs, toys, baby furniture. 13 miles north, Wilmington was stuck in the stagecoach era. Wilmington's only hotel, the Vermont House, was a sleepy place. The town was known, if at all, only as the birthplace of the mother of President Rutherford B. Hayes. Nearly all of the town's 1,300 people were descendants of the 67 founders. But Wilmington had pride. In 1890, it became one of the first American towns to stage an Old Home Week. Wilmington has repeated the reunion every 10 years to this day. Wilmington and nearby towns were desperate for access to the outside world. They paid the Newtons $49,000 to stretch the HT&W north. The New York Times sent a reporter to cover the coming of the train. The writer described Wilmington as a Green Mountain backwoods town whose old-fashioned people with old-fashioned notions have clung to the old-fashioned custom. It was a day of joy on November 4th, 1891, when the first train left the new station. Farmer E.A. Fitch was in his fields when he heard the whistle. The sound so stirred his soul that he wrote a poem. Did we ever hear a music sweeter than the one that thrills as it floats along the Deerfield, as it echoes o'er the hills? How we watch that little engine as it stalks across the plain. Was there ever music sweeter? Was there ever sight completer than the coming of the train? The Newton brothers ran the HT&W to Wilmington mainly to fetch the lumber and pulp to be generated by new mills the brothers were planning. But a happy consequence was that the railroad created tourism as a new local industry. So humble Ray Pond suddenly became Lake Raponda. A resort hotel went up, its guest list including Theodore Roosevelt and Rudyard Kipling. Swells from New York and Boston built the private Forest and Stream Club for trout fishing and hunting. The Vermont House added a tea room and became an annex of the new Child's Tavern, a hotel designed by architect Stanford White's renowned New York firm. New factories arose in Wilmington, turning out bowls, butter boxes, clothespins. Ox wagons of lumber rolled down Main Street. Grateful local passengers, at last able to chug down to North Adams for a day of shopping, dubbed their HT&W the Hoot, Toot, and Whistle, another name for the railroad descending 800 feet and struggling under looming cliffs was the Hold Tight and Worry. The Newton family had more grand ideas. Brother John C. Newton found an ideal spot for a dam, a mill pond to hold logs floated from the high country, and 3 mills. It was about 2 miles west of Wilmington, where 2 branches of the Deerfield River combine. The Newtons opened their company town in 1894, dubbing it Mountain Mills. The pulp mill and sawmill could run 6 months a year, until the winter harvested logs in the big mill pond were used up. The Newtons needed more labor than local towns could provide, so they built company housing and they imported workers, many of them ethnic Italians from Austria's South Tyrol. There were row house bungalows for families, a boarding house for single men. Prim Wilmington looked down on gritty mountain mills, and not without reason. The pulp mill smelled like rotten eggs, and prostitutes from New York and Boston set up camp in the settlement. Fire leveled mills in 1908, 1909, and 1913. 3 men died in a 1917 chemical explosion. Mountain Mills carried on, adding a water tower, an office building, a general store, a post office, and a 6-bed hospital.
These workmen that were up at Mountain Mills were mostly Italian and Irish. The priest from Reedsboro used to come up for Roman Catholic services quite a lot. This was the first that any people of some nationality besides English and so on had ever come to Wilmington when the pulp mills went in.
In 1904, the Newtons, tiring in their 70s, sold the Hoot, Toot, and Whistle. In 1906, they sold Mountain Mills and its timberlands to a group headed by Amos Blandin of New Hampshire. Blandin built a second railroad, the Deerfield River Railroad, 18 miles into the North Woods to haul out hardwood that wouldn't float on the river.
I began to go to school down here in 1905. I went to school there until 1912. When Mountain Mills was flourishing, they had between 30 and 35 children down here at Castle School, and then eventually they built a 2-room schoolhouse at Mountain Mills. It was just simply the old basic 2 years, and also history and geography, and we did have penmanship. I remember that we had a wood stove, one of these heavy iron stoves, and I used to stand right close to the stove, and every one of us that had these wool skirts or dresses at some time or other found holes or places in their wool, garments, because it did heat up terrifically. They used to spank the little ones just the same as the mothers would, and then they had a ruler that they called a ferrule, and they used to hit it pretty hard on the hands. Each farmer would have maybe 12 cows and maybe 2 pigs that would drink the skim milk while they sold the cream for butter, and they'd have 2 horses, and they'd have a mowing machine. They had a sugaring industry. Every farmer in those days had a nice sugar house, and they also sold their vegetables a lot at Mountain Mills for these people up there that didn't have gardens and so on, and to the boarding house and to the store. No, they just were independent and farmed on a small scale, but they were pretty well off in their day.
The Deerfield River plunges 2,200 feet through mountains that receive the most snow and rain in New England, potentially a powerful generator of electricity. Boston industrialists Henry Harriman and Malcolm Chase saw the promise of the 500-square-mile Deerfield watershed for a public utility, but in summer the Deerfield virtually dries up. Harriman and Chase envisioned a system of reservoirs and dams to even out the flow and control the power. They formed the New England Power Company, or NEPCO, to buy up river rights. Surveyors began working in the North Woods in 1909 for the Somerset Reservoir, built with steam shovels and help from the Deerfield River Railroad. The remote dam and reservoir opened for water storage in 1912. Harriman's engineers set another dam in the Valley Narrows at Davis Bridge in Whitingham, 9 miles south of Wilmington, would create a second, larger reservoir. Quiet Whitingham was known mainly by Mormons as the birthplace in 1801 of Brigham Young, the pioneer who led his co-religionists to Utah. Before dam building could start, Harriman needed to take over the Hoot, Toot, and Whistle and buy out properties in the valley. 40 farms and mountain mills, too. Ready for trouble, he got the Vermont legislature to grant NEPCO power to take private land by eminent domain. Harriman was ready to dig. It was the pro-business era of the Model T, Prohibition, and silent movies from Hollywood starring Charlie Chaplin, Lillian Gish, and Rudolph Valentino. There is no record of anyone in Wilmington seriously resisting a buyout. One time, Harriman did overplay his hand. Obligated to relocate flooded-out railroad tracks to higher ground, he tried to avoid the $250,000 expense. He proposed eliminating the tracks from Whitingham to Wilmington, replacing them with a summer ferryboat line on the reservoir, and handing Wilmington $100,000 in cash. Harriman failed to realize how much Wilmington loved and depended on its Hoot, Toot, and Whistle. Edith Roosevelt, Teddy's widow, said she had bought a summer home nearby only because she could reach it by train. And in a demonstration of democracy at a town meeting, Wilmington rejected Harriman's offer. The vote, 500 to nothing. The weekly Deerfield Valley Times wrote, "The town is fairly resigned to the prospect of becoming a summer resort on the shores of an inland sea. But the public," the reporters said, believed that losing the railroad would kill Wilmington. 1,200 men went to work for 2 years with steam shovels and horse teams, building the world's largest earthen dam at the time, a quarter of a mile long, towering 24 stories high. Bob Boyd recalls that his father worked on the $10 million project.
He was a teamster for Mr. Wheeler at the time, and he worked hauling rocks and stones for the dam. And it was a very tough job. Several people fell in when they were pouring cement, and there's no way of getting them out, so they're still in there.
A power company spokesman would neither confirm nor deny what he termed a rumor that one man fell from scaffolding into cement and was entombed. Farmers considered NEPCO's offers generous, but the company privately considered them a bargain. A 1996 corporate history says land costs were manageable because the flood-prone land had consisted mainly of declining farms and pastures. The farm families would not have shared that assessment. February 1924. As the dam nears readiness to hold the spring runoff, southern Vermont is about to be introduced much earlier than the rest of America to the post-industrial age. Mountain Mills is closed after 30 years, its machines sold off, its schoolhouse burned to the ground. Harriman, using an engineer's cool phrasing, announces that soon the valley will be flowed. Rummy Sullivan of Wilmington, now 87, was 1 year old and living on his grandfather's farm when it was flooded. He says farmers were heartbroken when the waters began to rise. President Calvin Coolidge, a native Vermonter, did not get involved. After all, it was Coolidge who said the business of America is business. Americans, electrifying their homes and buying radios and refrigerators in the booming 20s, wanted all the power they could get. And so the spring runoff came, and it ran up against the waiting dam. The Deerfield backed up the valley, inundating farms, mills, the small settlement of Sage City. The local weekly, deferential toward NEPCO, reported the lake's progress without comment. The Boyds, the Thomases, the Parsons, the Buffums, the Websters, the Quinns, the Wares, and others with the biggest and best farms in the valley, all were flowed out. 2,184 acres drowned, treasured places with them. 3 cemeteries were moved. 14 miles of roads were abandoned. Some farmers and Mountain Mills residents stayed to the last moment, a few waiting too long, evacuating by boat and losing possessions.
A lot of them refused to move off the farmlands down there. And, of course, the waters came up a lot faster than they had expected. You know, they thought it would take years to fill the thing, and it was, less than a month.
My mother never really accepted it, because her father and mother, they had a 2-story and a half house and big barns and lots of cattle, and they sold milk and cream, and they just couldn't see all these river valleys being flooded. They got very, very good prices for their farms from the New England Power Company, more than they were really worth in those days. But they didn't really want to move out and leave their home. It was not a physical strain, but a mental strain on their minds and memories and attitudes.
It was kind of a shock to people, really. It was a complete change of lifestyle. For so long, from the time the Newtons had come in the late 1800s and built mountain mills, the area was timber related. They made their living in the woods or in the lumber mills or in the pulp mills. Agriculture was not a big thing in the area. It was hard for farmers then to make a living. But the power company really wiped out everything. And I'm not sure people realized how much it was going to change things until it actually happened.
The Hoot, Toot, and Whistle continued to serve Wilmington until a disastrous flood destroyed a trestle in 1936. But the 11-mile track from the Hoosic Tunnel to Reedsboro kept running trains up to 1971. The Hoosic Tunnel still operates today. The 86 trains a day that used to go through now reduced to 2 freights of the Little Pan Am Railroad. By local legend, the long, dark 19th century tunnel is haunted by spirits. In partial place of the Hoot, Toot, and Whistle, the valley now offers free rides on the Mover, a non-profit transit line reaching as far from Wilmington as the big town of Brattleboro. Cattle-based Wilmington agriculture is very different now. Dairy farmers, their once famous cream and butter no longer competitive in price, have shifted to fluid milk. To make ends meet, some have commercialized their farms as entertainment venues, or they sell some pretty good maple syrup at roadside stands. On a small scale, logging, mostly by Canadian companies, goes on here and there. First called Lake NEPCO, the Davis Bridge Power Project was renamed for Henry Harriman in 1929. NEPCO sold out in 1998 to a Pacific Gas and Electric subsidiary, which went bankrupt and sold to TransCanada of Calgary in 2005. The dam's special feature is the Glory Hole, a concrete spillway shaped like a morning glory blossom. It prevents high water from topping the dam and eroding its earthen core. Harriman Dam cranks out 45 megawatts, enough for 4,500 homes. It's a key factor in a system of dams, reservoirs, and power stations along 65 miles of the hard-working Deerfield, all run by remote control from Monroe Bridge, Massachusetts, producing electricity sold into the New England wholesale power market. Boston and other cities get most of the power, while Wilmington, with little manufacturing, has a service economy based on seasonal tourism. The opening of the Mount Snow ski area, 12 miles north in 1953, gave Wilmington its first winter tourism. Fall brings leaf peepers driving in for the spectacular Vermont foliage. Summer brings the most visitors to the Deerfield Valley. Water releases from the dams enable 50,000 whitewater rafters to brave rapids in Massachusetts. TransCanada, like its predecessors, is public-spirited about maintaining public access for recreational areas. While much of this is required under the 1994 relicensing of the dams by federal officials, the power companies have been particularly broad-minded in hosting recreational activities that have brought a measure of fame to one spot on Lake Whitingham. When summer travelers roll through on Route 9, Wilmington scrambles to get them to stop and spend, adjusting to changing times and selling not lumber now, but Vermont itself. The 1906 school desk factory on North Main Street, which went broke and became a sawmill, is now the Old Red Mill Inn. The blue-collar workers of the old days would not believe how many art galleries Wilmington has today, side by side with a variety of gift and curio shops. The Mount Snow Valley Chamber of Commerce works hard to think up events that will keep the beds and cash registers filled. There is, for example, a September Wine and Harvest Festival, and in August, a Blueberry Festival. Some older traditions endure. In 2010, Old Home Week, staged on schedule every 10 years since 1890, brought former residents back to Wilmington from as far as Hong Kong. The parade had a record number of bands. 200 members of the long-established Boyd family filled floats. All a lot of fun, but many in the Deerfield Valley believe the area needs more than parades. What it needs, they say, is economic development, more jobs. Reedsboro, for instance, is a shadow of the bustling factory town it was 100 years ago.
The peak population was in 1900. Maybe it's gone back a little bit up here in Wilmington it has now in the last 20 or 30 years because of the tourists and the ski areas and things, but the rest of the valley, the industrial base is gone.
Is that a bad thing? When you look at those ugly smokestacks of mountain mills and you look at that beautiful lake, something was gained and something was lost.
I guess whether it's a good thing or a bad thing depends upon whether you're the guy that lost the job or not, or lost his farm, or whether you're the guy that came and capitalized on the new industry that came in. The power company created an awful lot of jobs all the way down the river. My father worked for the power company for 30 years. They were a wonderful company to work for back in the 50s and 60s. If you worked for the New England Power Company, you were pretty well set in life.
Under a boat launch ramp at a picnic area rest the remains of Mountain Mills. The noisy, smelly old smokestack town was remembered for years in the name of a lake excursion boat, the Mountain Mills. But the boat was beached in the current recession. The name survives now only in the picnic area. When the lake level is low enough, you can see the ruins of a mill and the railroad trestle. Visible every day are the foundations of the old office building and the water tower. Historian Brian Donaldson says Mountain Mills probably would not have survived in any event.
A heavy industry in Mountain Mills today would not be competitive in today's world. We can't compete with a relatively small lumber mill this far removed from transportation and from the rest of the world.
The Castle School, unused since the Mountain Mills School opened in 1918, survived the flooding. It is not clear why. Either the power company did not choose to buy it, or the company wanted it, but the town would not sell it, and by law could not lose it through eminent domain.
I believe the schoolhouse survived because of its historic value on the edge of the shore. Potentially had some historic and values, and was left because it was a schoolhouse.
In 1927, Wilmington voted to sell the vacant Castle Schoolhouse to Greeley Brown, a local businessman. He was the nephew of the fabulously wealthy Martin Brown, who had been a key ally of the Newton brothers. The schoolhouse, never winterized, passed through two more owners until in 1956 it was sold to John and Mary Hawkins of Northport, Long Island. With their 5-year-old daughter, Irma, they began to make the old house their own, improving it, enjoying it in all seasons, living out their lives here as they bequeathed Irma a love of nature, a deep reverence for Vermont, and a lifetime of memories. After the reservoir was filled, the New England Power Company reforested the surrounding farmlands so uncovered soil would not erode and fill the reservoir. Under an agreement with federal regulators for perpetual conservation, TransCanada can never develop these woodlands. They will be green for as long as the lake produces hydroelectric energy, such a green form of power that few now question whether the reservoir has benefited the region.
Is a great thing in the area. It's created quite a recreation area for the local valley and the local residents, and it has been a benefit to mankind here.
Overlooking the lake is the 21st century's version of green electric power, Green Mountain Power's Searsburg Wind Turbine Facility, meeting the needs of 1,400 homes. Below at our summer place, the past is still with us. Low water in late summer reveals the foundations of Philo Castle's 19th century farm buildings. Irma and I can still make out initials carved in the old privy door by long-departed school children. Perhaps they were boys and girls from farms across the river, or perhaps they were immigrant children from Mountain Mills. All we know is that the children grew up, the railroads and the sawmills had their day, and all of us can enjoy a gem set in the Green Mountains. An inland sea we value even more now that we know the sacrifices and regrets rippling just below the surface.